Last summer, a trail camera in the Alaskan wilderness captured something that has law enforcement and wildlife experts completely baffled. Multiple citizens across the region have been reporting the same creature, describing it in eerily similar terms. What started as isolated incidents has become a pattern that suggests Alaska might be harboring one of North America's most elusive cryptids, the Dogman. The footage I'm about to describe came to me through an email from a property owner who wishes to remain anonymous. He's not the only one seeing these creatures. The reports keep coming in, and they all point to the same terrifying conclusion. So before we continue, make sure you subscribe and let us know where you're watching from. Thanks. I work as an investigator in Alaska, and I've seen a lot of strange things in my years on the job. Bears doing unusual things, wolves behaving oddly, even the occasional hoax. But nothing prepared me for what crossed my desk last August. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning, and the subject line simply read, "Urgent wildlife situation." The sender explained that he'd set up trail cameras on his property about 40 miles outside Fairbanks. He'd been checking the cameras every few weeks, mostly capturing images of moose, bears, and the occasional wolf pack. But on July 15th, one camera activated at 3:47 in the morning. What it recorded stopped him cold. The image shows a creature standing among fallen logs and dense forest undergrowth. The lighting is dim, typical of pre-dawn hours, but the camera's motion sensor had triggered the flash. Two eyes reflected the light directly back at the lens, creating that distinctive eye shine you see in nocturnal animals. But this was no ordinary animal. The creature appears to be standing upright or in a semi-upright position. Its body mass suggests something much larger than a wolf, and the posture is all wrong for a bear. The head is distinctly canine, with a pronounced snout, and what appears to be pointed ears set high on the skull. Dark fur covers the visible portions of the body. What struck me immediately was the way it looked directly at the camera. Not the vacant stare of an animal that accidentally triggered a sensor, but focused attention. The creature seemed to be inspecting the device, studying it. According to the camera's metadata, it remained in frame for approximately 11 seconds before moving off to the right. The property owner wrote that this wasn't his first encounter with such creatures. He'd caught glimpses of similar beings on his land 3 times over the past 2 years. Each sighting involved an upright, canine-like figure, moving through the woods with purpose and intelligence. He emphasized creatures, plural, suggesting multiple individuals. He included a detailed account of his previous sightings. The first happened during a late evening walk along his property line. He'd heard something large moving through the brush parallel to his path. When he turned his flashlight toward the sound, he saw a massive dark shape slip behind a cluster of spruce trees. The movement was fluid and deliberate. The second sighting occurred while he was chopping firewood behind his cabin. He felt the distinct sensation of being watched and looked up to see a figure observing him from approximately 60 yards away. It stood motionless among the trees, partially obscured by shadows. When he took a step toward it, the figure dropped to all fours and vanished into the forest. The third encounter was the most unsettling. He'd been driving home around midnight when his headlights caught something crossing the road ahead. A large, dark form moved from the tree line on one side to the other. It crossed the road in 3 powerful strides before disappearing into the darkness. The height and gait were unlike anything he'd seen before. His email concluded with a statement that has stuck with me. He wrote that he believed Alaska was a hotspot for these creatures, that the vast wilderness and sparse human population created perfect conditions for something large and intelligent to remain hidden. He'd spoken quietly with neighbors who'd also seen things they couldn't explain. Nobody wanted to go on record, but the stories were consistent. I began pulling files and cross-referencing reports. What I found was disturbing in its consistency. Over the past 5 years, at least 17 separate individuals had filed reports about encounters with upright, canine-like creatures in the Alaska region. Most were dismissed or attributed to misidentified bears, but the descriptions matched too closely to ignore. The Dogman phenomenon isn't new to North America. Reports of werewolf-like creatures date back centuries, woven into the folklore of indigenous peoples long before European contact. The Inuit have stories of the adlet, creatures born from the union of a woman and a red dog, said to have the lower body of a canine and the upper body of a human. Further south, Native American tribes across the continent have similar legends. The Navajo speak of skinwalkers, witches, who can transform into animals. The Ojibwe tell of the Wendigo, though that's typically associated with cannibalism and winter starvation rather than wolf-like transformations. But scattered among these well-known legends are quieter stories about wolfmen who walk upright through the forests. The modern dogman phenomenon gained attention in Michigan during the late 1980s. A radio DJ created a song about creature sightings in that state, and the response was overwhelming. Hundreds of people came forward with their own encounters, describing creatures that walked on two legs, had wolf-like heads, and displayed intelligence beyond that of normal animals. Since then, reports have emerged from nearly every state with substantial wilderness. Alaska's vast wilderness makes it an ideal location for any creature that wants to avoid human contact. The state contains over 365 million acres of land, much of it roadless and rarely visited by people. Dense forests, mountain ranges, and tundra provide endless hiding places. If something wanted to remain unseen, Alaska would be the perfect refuge. The climate poses another factor. Alaska's harsh winters and midnight sun summers create an environment where most people stay indoors for significant portions of the year. During the dark winter months, when the sun barely rises and temperatures plummet to deadly lows, few venture far from established settlements. These conditions would allow a creature to move about with minimal risk of detection. I started reaching out to colleagues across the state, asking if they'd heard similar reports. A wildlife officer in Juneau mentioned 2 separate incidents where hunters had reported seeing large, bipedal figures moving through the forest at dusk. Both hunters were experienced outdoorsmen who knew the difference between a bear on its hind legs and something else entirely. They'd both left the area immediately. A state trooper based near Anchorage recalled taking a report from a family who'd been camping in the Chugach National Forest. They'd heard something large moving around their campsite after dark, breathing heavily and occasionally emitting low growls that didn't sound quite like a bear or wolf. When the father shone his flashlight into the trees, he saw a pair of eyes reflecting back at a height of approximately 7 feet. The family packed up and left before dawn. A biologist I know who studies wolf populations shared an interesting observation. She'd been tracking a pack in the interior when she found tracks that puzzled her. They were canine in shape, but significantly larger than any wolf print she'd documented. The stride length suggested a creature walking on 2 legs rather than 4. She'd photographed the prints but never filed an official report, knowing the reaction she'd likely receive. These weren't hysterical people prone to wild stories. They were professionals, trained observers who understood wildlife and wilderness, yet something had frightened or confused them enough to mention it to me when I asked. The pattern was clear, but the explanation remained elusive. I decided to visit the property where the trail camera footage was captured. The drive took me through increasingly remote terrain. Paved roads gave way to gravel, then to rough dirt tracks that required 4-wheel drive. The property sat at the end of a long driveway, surrounded by dense forest on 3 sides and backing up to a ridge that rose several hundred feet. Perfect isolation for someone who valued privacy, and perfect habitat for something that didn't want to be found. The owner met me at the cabin. He was in his 60s, weathered and fit, with the look of someone who'd spent most of his life outdoors. He walked me to the location where the camera had captured the footage. The spot was approximately 300 yards from the cabin, along a game trail that animals used to access a small creek. The fallen logs visible in the image were still there, though months had passed and snow had come and gone several times. He pointed out where the creature had been standing when the camera triggered. The position gave a clear view of the trail in both directions, suggesting the creature had stopped there deliberately, perhaps to watch for movement along the path. We examined the area for any physical evidence. The ground had been through multiple freeze-thaw cycles since July, making it impossible to find preserved tracks. But the owner pointed out several trees with marks on them, scratches in the bark at heights between 5 and 7 feet. Some appeared fresh, others weathered by time and exposure. He'd found similar marks throughout his property. He showed me 3 other locations where he'd caught glimpses of something unusual. Each spot offered good cover and clear sight lines, places where a predator might watch and wait. One location near the property boundary had a clear view of the main road leading to the cabin. Another overlooked a clearing where deer often grazed in the early morning. The third location disturbed me the most. It was positioned with a direct view of the cabin's back door and windows. Something had been watching the house. The owner admitted this was partly why he'd set up the trail cameras in the first place. He'd felt observed for months before he caught anything on film. That feeling of being watched had grown stronger over time. He told me about the sounds he'd heard on clear nights. Heavy footfalls in the forest, moving with a 2-beat rhythm rather than the 4-beat pattern of a quadruped. Vocalizations that started as wolf-like howls but descended into deeper, more guttural tones. Occasionally something that sounded almost like speech, though the words were incomprehensible if they were words at all. His nearest neighbor lived 2 miles away through dense forest. I made the trip to speak with her. She was hesitant at first, clearly uncomfortable discussing the subject. But when I assured her I was taking the report seriously, she opened up. She'd seen something crossing her property 3 months earlier, just after dawn. It had moved from the tree line toward a storage shed, walking upright like a person but with a distinctly animal profile. She'd watched through her kitchen window as the creature paused at the shed, appeared to sniff the air, then continued toward the forest on the opposite side of her property. The encounter lasted perhaps 30 seconds. She'd called the Alaska State Troopers, but by the time an officer arrived hours later, there was nothing to see. The officer had suggested it was probably a bear, and she'd accepted that explanation because it was easier than believing the alternative. But she didn't believe it was a bear. Bears don't move that way. She'd lived in Alaska her entire life, and knew how bears walked on their hind legs. This had been different, more fluid and natural, as if walking upright was its normal mode of locomotion. The proportions were wrong for a bear too, the body leaner and the limbs longer. She'd kept quiet about it since then, not wanting people to think she was crazy. I drove back to Fairbanks and started digging through historical records. The Alaska State Library had archived newspaper collections going back to the territorial days. I spent hours scrolling through microfilm, looking for any mention of unusual creatures or strange encounters. What I found was remarkable. Reports of wolf men and upright canines appeared sporadically but consistently throughout Alaska's recorded history. An article from 1937 described a prospector near Nome who claimed to have been stalked by something he called a devil dog. He said the creature followed him for 3 days as he worked his claim, always staying just out of clear sight, but making its presence known. He abandoned the claim and never returned, insisting something unnatural lived in those hills. A 1952 edition featured a story about trappers near Bethel who reported losing catch from their trap lines. The animals weren't eaten, just removed and carried away. They'd found tracks that looked like large dog prints, but the stride suggested bipedal movement. The trappers set up a watch one night and heard something moving through the darkness, breathing hard, and occasionally vocalizing in a way that made them too frightened to investigate. A 1973 article mentioned a group of hunters who'd encountered something near Denali. They'd made camp and were sitting around the fire when they heard branches breaking in the forest around them. Multiple sets of eyes reflected their firelight from the darkness, but the positions were too high for wolves. The hunters fired shots into the air, and whatever was out there moved away, but they'd heard footsteps running on 2 legs rather than 4. The indigenous peoples of Alaska have their own traditions regarding such creatures. I spoke with an elder from a village in the interior who was willing to discuss the old stories. He explained that his people had always known about the dog-faced ones, creatures that walk like men but had the heads and appetites of wolves. They were considered dangerous and were avoided whenever possible. The elder said his grandfather had seen one when he was young. The creature had appeared at the edge of their fishing camp one evening, standing upright among the trees and watching them work. His grandfather had spoken a prayer in their language, and the creature had turned and walked away into the forest. After that, His grandfather had always insisted they leave offerings of fish at certain locations before making camp in that area. The tradition of leaving offerings suggested long-term coexistence between the people and these creatures. If the stories were true, both groups had learned to give each other space, to respect boundaries and avoid conflict. But with modern development pushing into previously untouched wilderness, those old agreements might be breaking down. Human presence in formerly remote areas could be forcing encounters that previous generations had avoided through traditional knowledge. I contacted researchers who study other cryptids, trying to understand the broader phenomenon. The Dogman description matches reports from Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, suggesting either multiple populations of the same species or a widespread mythology based on common archetypes. The consistency of descriptions across different regions and different witnesses argues against simple misidentification or hoax. The creatures are typically described as standing between 6 and 8 feet tall when upright. They have muscular builds, powerful limbs, and canine heads with pronounced snouts. The eyes are often described as amber, yellow, or green, and they reflect light intensely in darkness. The behavior is notably intelligent, suggesting problem-solving ability and possibly even language or complex communication. Witnesses consistently report a sense of being observed or followed. The creatures seem to study humans from a distance rather than immediately attacking. This behavior differs from typical predator patterns and suggests curiosity or intelligence assessment. Some researchers theorize these creatures might be evaluating whether humans pose a threat before deciding how to respond. The Alaska reports fit this pattern. Most encounters involve the creature watching humans from a distance, sometimes following them, but rarely approaching closely. Only a handful of reports describe aggressive behavior, and those typically occurred when the witness approached the creature rather than the other way around. This suggests territorial behavior or defensive responses rather than predatory intent. I returned to the original trail camera footage, studying it frame by frame. The creature's posture showed confidence rather than fear. It hadn't been startled by the camera's activation. Instead, it appeared to be examining the device, possibly understanding that the flash meant detection. The fact that it moved away after 11 seconds suggested awareness that it had been photographed and a decision to leave the area. The eyes in the image bothered me most. The reflection showed clear eyeshine, common in nocturnal animals with a tapetum lucidum, the reflective layer behind the retina that enhances night vision. But the positioning and focus suggested intelligence, awareness, thought. These weren't the blank eyes of a deer caught in headlights. This was a thinking creature that understood it had been seen. I compiled all the reports I could find and mapped them. The sightings clustered in specific areas, primarily in the interior and western regions of Alaska. The clusters appeared around major river systems and mountain ranges, areas with abundant wildlife and minimal human presence. Several hotspots emerged, locations where multiple encounters had occurred over the years. The property where the trail camera footage was captured sat at the edge of one of these hotspots. Within a 50-mile radius, I documented 12 separate encounters over the past decade. The consistency of location suggested either a resident population or regular movement through the area. If these creatures existed, this region would be prime habitat. I started receiving more emails after word spread that I was taking these reports seriously. A fisherman described seeing something wading through a river at dusk, moving upright through waist-deep water with powerful strokes. A pilot reported spotting a large figure running across a remote valley, moving faster than any bear he'd ever seen. A highway worker mentioned finding massive canine-like prints in soft ground near a construction site, prints that showed only 4 toes but were far too large for any known wolf. Each report added another piece to the puzzle. Individually, they could be explained away as misidentifications or overactive imaginations, but collectively, they painted a picture of something living in Alaska's wilderness, something large and intelligent that had learned to avoid human contact, while occasionally revealing itself either by accident or by choice. The question of whether these creatures actually exist remains unanswered. I haven't seen one myself, despite spending weeks in areas where sightings have been reported, but the consistency of witness testimony, the quality of the individuals making reports, and the historical record of similar encounters make me hesitant to dismiss the phenomenon entirely. Something is happening in Alaska's wilderness that we don't fully understand. The scientific establishment struggles with cryptid reports because they lack physical evidence that meets rigorous standards. No body has been recovered, no skeleton found, no DNA sample collected that can't be attributed to known species. Critics argue this absence of evidence proves these creatures don't exist. But Alaska's vast wilderness could hide multiple populations of large animals without them ever coming into regular contact with humans or leaving recoverable remains. Consider that the Bili ape, a population of unusually large chimpanzees in the Congo, wasn't officially documented until 2003, despite local knowledge of their existence for generations. The saola, a large mammal in Vietnam, wasn't discovered by science until 1992. New species are still being found in remote areas. The absence of official documentation doesn't necessarily mean absence of the creature itself. The behavioral patterns described in Dogman encounters suggest a species highly adapted to avoiding detection. If these creatures possess human-level or near-human-level intelligence, they could actively evade documentation. They might understand cameras and avoid them, recognize that leaving remains draws attention, and teach their young to stay away from humans. This would make them extremely difficult to study or prove scientifically. I've spent months investigating these reports, and my conclusion is uncertain but sobering. I cannot prove these creatures exist, but I also cannot dismiss the weight of consistent testimony from credible witnesses. Something is happening in Alaska. Whether it's a flesh and blood creature, a species of North American ape that science hasn't acknowledged, or something else entirely remains unknown. But the encounters continue, and the reports keep coming in. The property owner who sent me the original footage has captured 3 more images since that July morning. Each shows the same area near the game trail. 2 images show nothing unusual, just the expected wildlife. But the third shows a dark figure at the edge of the frame, partially obscured by trees. It's too far away and too poorly lit to make out details. But the shape is wrong for any animal that should be there. He stopped checking the cameras alone. He brings a friend now, someone who can watch his back while he retrieves the memory cards. He's also installed motion-sensitive lights around his cabin and keeps firearms easily accessible. Not because the creature has shown aggression, but because the feeling of being watched has intensified. He knows something is out there, and he's taking precautions. His experience mirrors what other witnesses have described. The initial encounter brings shock and disbelief. Then comes a period of rationalization, trying to explain away what was seen. But as time passes and the encounters continue, acceptance sets in. Something unexplained is sharing the wilderness with them, and they must learn to coexist with it. The Alaska Department of Fish and Game hasn't issued any official statements about these reports. When pressed, officials acknowledge receiving occasional reports of unusual sightings but maintain their likely misidentified bears or other known wildlife. No formal investigation has been launched and no resources have been allocated to studying the phenomenon. This is understandable given budget constraints and the lack of physical evidence, but it frustrates witnesses who feel their experiences are being dismissed. I've forwarded all my compiled information to the department with a recommendation that they at least acknowledge the pattern of reports. Even if they can't or won't investigate, documenting the sightings could prove valuable if more concrete evidence eventually emerges. The response was polite but non-committal. They thanked me for my interest and assured me they take all wildlife reports seriously. The question remains, is Alaska a Dogman hotspot? Based on the frequency and consistency of reports compared to the state's human population, I'd argue yes. The ratio of encounters to residents is higher here than in most other states where similar creatures have been reported. The vast wilderness provides ideal habitat. The sparse human presence reduces the risk of detection. The abundance of wildlife offers ample food sources for a large predator. Indigenous traditions and historical accounts suggest these creatures have been here far longer than European settlement. If they exist, they're not invaders, but original inhabitants of this land. The increase in modern sightings might reflect human expansion into previously undisturbed areas, rather than an increase in creature population. We're moving into their territory, not the other way around. Climate change could also play a role, As Alaska's climate warms, vegetation patterns shift, and wildlife distributions change. Creatures that once had unlimited wilderness might be finding their habitat shrinking, leading to more encounters with humans. Alternatively, improved trail cameras and other technology might simply be documenting what was always there, but previously went unrecorded. The trail camera footage remains the best evidence I've encountered. The image is clear enough to show details, but ambiguous enough to avoid definitive identification. Believers see a dogman. Skeptics see a bear or a trick of light and shadow. The truth lies somewhere in that ambiguity, waiting for more evidence to tip the scales one way or another. I've presented my findings to colleagues and the responses have been mixed. Some are intrigued and want to learn more. Others are dismissive, pointing out the lack of physical evidence and the problems with eyewitness testimony. A few have quietly admitted their own strange experiences in the wilderness, things they saw or heard that didn't fit their understanding of Alaska's wildlife. They appreciate someone taking these reports seriously. The investigation continues. I've set up a confidential reporting system for anyone who has an encounter they want documented. Reports come in regularly, some clearly misidentifications or hoaxes, but others that fit the established pattern. Each credible report gets added to the database, building a comprehensive picture of when, where, and how these encounters occur. One pattern that's emerged involves time of day. Most sightings happen during twilight hours, either at dawn or dusk. This matches the behavior of crepuscular animals that are most active during these transitional periods. It also suggests these creatures might have vision adapted to low light conditions, allowing them to move and hunt when most predators and prey are less active. Weather seems to play a role too. Many encounters occur during overcast conditions or light rain, times when visibility is reduced and sound travels differently. These conditions would favor a creature that relies on stealth and wants to avoid detection. Clear, bright days produce fewer reports, suggesting these creatures might wait for favorable conditions before moving through areas where they might be seen. The geographic distribution shows preference for areas with mixed terrain, places where forests meet open spaces, or mountains descend into valleys. These transition zones offer the best hunting opportunities and multiple escape routes if discovered. They also provide vantage points for observation, allowing the creatures to watch human activity from safe distances before deciding whether to avoid an area or move through it. I've noticed something else in the reports, a sense of profound unease that witnesses describe feeling during encounters. It's more than simple fear of a large predator. They describe a deep instinctual reaction, as if some ancient part of their brain recognizes a threat that conscious thought can't quite identify. This response suggests these creatures might trigger primal fears left over from our evolutionary past when humans were not always apex predators. The owner of the property with the trail camera described this feeling perfectly. He said that when he knows the creature is nearby, he experiences a sensation like ice water in his veins. Every instinct screams at him to leave the area immediately. It's not panic, but a clear, cold awareness of danger that he's learned to trust. Other witnesses have described similar reactions. This response might be adaptive, a survival mechanism that kept our ancestors alive when they shared the landscape with dangerous predators. If these creatures exist and have coexisted with humans for millennia, we might have evolved an innate recognition of their presence, a warning system that triggers when we encounter them. The fact that so many witnesses describe identical feelings supports this theory. I've expanded my research into other states with similar reports. The Michigan Dogman phenomenon is well documented, with hundreds of reported sightings over several decades. Wisconsin has its own tradition of werewolf encounters, particularly around the Beast of Bray Road. Pennsylvania, Ohio, and several other states have consistent reports of upright canines. The descriptions match Alaska's reports remarkably well, despite geographic separation. This either suggests a widespread species of unknown canid that's managed to avoid scientific documentation, or it points to a common psychological phenomenon where humans interpret unusual encounters through similar mythological frameworks. The scientific community generally favors the latter explanation, viewing cryptid reports as manifestations of folklore and misidentification rather than evidence of unknown species. But that explanation struggles with the specific details that remain consistent across reports. Witnesses describe the same body proportions, the same distinctive gait, the same behavioral patterns. If these were simply misidentified bears, we'd expect more variation in descriptions. Bears vary significantly in size, color, and behavior, yet Dogman reports show remarkable consistency in the creature's appearance and actions. The possibility that these creatures represent a relic population of some prehistoric species has been proposed by some researchers. Perhaps a lineage of carnivorous mammals that evolved bipedal locomotion survived in isolated populations across North America. The fossil record shows that diverse experimental body plans existed throughout evolutionary history. Not all of them left descendants that we've identified. Alaska's fossil record is incomplete, particularly for the interior regions where permafrost and difficult terrain make paleontological work challenging. Unknown species could have lived here and either gone extinct or survived in small populations without leaving fossil evidence that's been discovered. The state's changing climate during ice ages would have created refugia where species could survive while the landscape around them transformed. I've started collaborating with wildlife biologists who study large predators. They've shared insights into how wolves and bears use the landscape, their movement patterns, and territorial behaviors. Comparing known predator behavior to the patterns in Dogman reports reveals interesting differences. These creatures seem to have larger territories and move through them more deliberately, suggesting either lower population density or more sophisticated territorial organization. The lack of physical evidence remains the biggest challenge. No bodies, no bones, no confirmed hair samples. Critics point to this as proof that these creatures don't exist. If they were real animals, we'd find remains eventually. Dead animals leave traces, but in Alaska's wilderness, remains can disappear quickly. Scavengers, weather, and dense vegetation can eliminate evidence of death within weeks. If these creatures also preferentially die in remote locations, finding remains would be even more unlikely. Some researchers have suggested these creatures might bury their dead, a behavior seen in some intelligent animals. Elephants are known to show interest in elephant bones and sometimes cover them with vegetation. If Dogman creatures possess high intelligence, they might practice similar behavior, actively hiding their dead to avoid drawing attention from predators or humans. This would explain the absence of remains despite what could be a stable population. The trail camera network is expanding. Several property owners in the identified hotspot areas have agreed to set up cameras on their land and share footage. We're creating a more comprehensive monitoring system that might capture more images or even video of these creatures. The cameras are positioned along game trails, near water sources, and in areas where previous sightings occurred. So far, the new cameras have captured typical Alaska wildlife: moose, bears, wolves, foxes, and lynx. But we've only been operating for 3 months. If these creatures are real and as intelligent as witnesses suggest, they might be aware of the cameras and avoiding them. Some researchers who study great apes have found that chimps quickly learn to recognize and avoid camera traps. If Dogman creatures possess similar intelligence, they'd adapt to monitoring efforts quickly. I've received criticism for taking these reports seriously. Some colleagues believe I'm wasting time and resources on something that doesn't exist. Others worry that giving credence to cryptid reports undermines serious wildlife research. I understand these concerns, but I also believe that dismissing consistent witness testimony without proper investigation is poor science. The unknown deserves serious inquiry, not automatic rejection. The truth is, we don't know everything about Alaska's ecosystem. New species are discovered regularly, usually small organisms, but occasionally larger animals that avoided previous detection. The wilderness is vast and largely unstudied. Assumptions about what can and cannot exist here should be held tentatively, subject to revision as new evidence emerges. Absolute certainty about the absence of unknown species is unwarranted given how much remains unexplored. The property owner continues to document his experiences. He's kept detailed journals noting every unusual sound, every instance of feeling watched, every piece of potential evidence he finds on his land. The journals reveal a pattern of activity, with encounters more common during certain months and times. Late summer and early fall see increased activity. possibly related to creatures preparing for winter or taking advantage of salmon runs. He's not alone in his experiences anymore. Others in the area have started sharing their stories, creating an informal network of people who've encountered these creatures. They compare notes, share strategies for staying safe, and support each other when the isolation and strangeness become overwhelming. This community has been invaluable for witnesses who previously felt alone in their experiences and afraid of ridicule. The network has identified several locations where multiple independent witnesses have reported encounters. These sites are now considered high-probability areas for future sightings. Some are near rivers, others in mountain passes, a few in dense forest areas with good cover. The common factor seems to be remoteness combined with abundant wildlife, exactly the habitat where a large, elusive predator would thrive. One location in particular has drawn attention. A valley about 60 miles north of Fairbanks, where 3 separate witnesses reported encounters over 2 years. The valley is accessible only by rough trail and sees minimal human traffic. Wildlife is abundant, and the terrain offers excellent observation points and escape routes. If I were looking for definitive evidence, this valley would be my primary target. Planning an expedition to the valley is complicated. Alaska's wilderness requires serious preparation and significant resources. Weather can turn deadly quickly. Wildlife poses real dangers, confirmed bears and wolves, not just hypothetical cryptids. Equipment failures in remote locations can be fatal. Any investigation would need to be carefully planned and properly equipped. The goal would be to establish monitoring stations and conduct systematic observations over an extended period. Funding such an expedition is another challenge. Official wildlife research funds won't support cryptid investigation. Private funding sources are limited and often come with expectations of dramatic results that serious research can't guarantee. The work would likely need to be done on a volunteer basis using personal resources and donated equipment. This limits what's possible but doesn't eliminate the opportunity entirely. I keep returning to the trail camera footage, studying those reflective eyes staring back at the lens. Whatever triggered that camera was real, physical, present in that moment. The image exists. The metadata confirms the time and date. Something was standing there in the pre-dawn darkness of an Alaska forest, and the camera captured it. Whether that something was a dogman or something else entirely, I can't say with certainty, but it demands investigation rather than dismissal. The reports continue to arrive. Last week, a survey crew working on a pipeline project reported seeing something watching them from a ridgeline. 2 weeks ago, a family camping near Denali heard something large moving around their tent at night, breathing heavily and occasionally vocalizing. A month ago, a hunting guide found tracks he couldn't identify, large canine prints showing only 4 toes, but with a stride length suggesting bipedal movement. Each report by itself might be explained away, but the pattern persists, growing stronger with each new account. Something is happening in Alaska's wilderness. Whether it's a population of undocumented creatures, a case of mass misidentification, or something else entirely, the phenomenon deserves serious attention. The witnesses deserve to have their experiences acknowledged and investigated rather than automatically dismissed. I've made my position clear to colleagues and superiors. I believe Alaska is experiencing genuine encounters with an unknown animal. The consistency of reports across decades, the credibility of witnesses, and the existence of physical evidence like the trail camera footage convince me that something real is occurring. I cannot prove what that something is, but I'm committed to finding out. The behavioral patterns documented in the reports reveal sophisticated intelligence. Witnesses describe creatures that seem to understand property boundaries, that avoid areas with heavy human activity, and that modify their behavior based on human presence. One property owner noticed that after he installed motion lights, the creatures changed their approach routes to stay in shadows. Another reported that strange sounds stopped after he mounted cameras, suggesting awareness of surveillance. This intelligence manifests in other ways, too. Several witnesses describe encounters where the creatures appeared to be testing human reactions. One man reported that something threw rocks near his cabin for 3 consecutive nights, each night getting slightly closer but never actually hitting the structure. When he fired warning shots, the activity stopped completely. The escalating pattern, followed by immediate cessation, suggests learning and decision-making. The comparison to great apes is instructive. Gorillas and chimpanzees demonstrate complex social structures, tool use, and territorial behaviors. They can recognize individual humans, remember past encounters, and modify their behavior accordingly. If dogman creatures possess similar cognitive abilities combined with physical advantages like size and strength, they'd be formidable survivors capable of avoiding detection despite living in proximity to human settlements. Language or communication abilities remain speculative but intriguing. Several witnesses have reported vocalizations that sound structured, like speech in an unknown language. One hunting guide recorded audio of what he described as two creatures communicating across a valley. The sounds included howls, barks, and what might have been more complex vocalizations. Analysis of the recording showed patterns that didn't match known wolf or coyote communication. The recording exists but hasn't been conclusively identified. Social structure is another mystery. Most reports describe solitary creatures, but several encounters involve multiple individuals. A family camping near Takitna reported seeing 3 figures moving through the forest in coordinated fashion, suggesting pack behavior or family groups. If these creatures live in groups, they'd need substantial territories and significant food sources. Alaska's abundant wildlife could support small populations of large predators that current wildlife counts don't account for. The question of what these creatures eat has practical implications. Alaska supports populations of moose, caribou, Dall sheep, and numerous smaller mammals. A large predator would need to take down prey regularly to maintain body mass. Yet there are no reports of unusual predation patterns or carcasses showing signs of kills that don't match known predators. Either these creatures are remarkably efficient at concealing their hunting activities, or they have feeding strategies that don't leave obvious evidence. One theory suggests they might be opportunistic feeders, like bears, consuming both meat and plant matter. Alaska's berry season could provide substantial calories. Salmon runs offer another rich food source. The timing of many sightings coincides with salmon spawning season, when bears and other predators congregate near streams. If dogman creatures follow similar patterns, they'd be moving through areas where encounters with humans are more likely. The relationship between these creatures and known predators raises questions. How do they interact with bears and wolves? Are they competitors for resources, or do they occupy different ecological niches? One witness described seeing a dogman and a grizzly bear in the same area, both apparently aware of each other but maintaining distance. The bear appeared wary, suggesting these creatures might be apex predators that even grizzlies respect. Winter survival presents another challenge for any large mammal in Alaska. Temperatures can drop to 40 below zero or colder. Food becomes scarce. Most large animals either hibernate, migrate, or have specific adaptations for cold weather survival. If dogman creatures are year-round residents, they'd need significant physiological adaptations, thick fur, efficient metabolism, and probably denning behavior during the coldest months. Several reports mention finding what might be den sites, sheltered locations with signs of regular use. The cultural impact of these reports on local communities is significant. In areas with frequent sightings, people have modified their behavior. Some avoid certain trails after dark. Others have installed additional security measures around their homes. Parents warn children to stay close and not wander into the forest alone. Whether or not the creatures are real, the belief in their existence has real-world effects on how people interact with the wilderness. Tourism presents a complicated factor. Some businesses have begun marketing dogman tours and expeditions, promising visitors the chance to search for Alaska's cryptids. This commercialization risks trivializing genuine research while potentially disturbing any real creatures that might exist. It also brings more people into remote areas, which could either produce more evidence or drive the creatures deeper into wilderness, where they're even harder to study. I've had conversations with native elders from several different cultural groups across Alaska. Their perspectives vary, but common themes emerge. Most acknowledge traditions about beings that walk like men but have animal natures. Some view them as spiritual entities rather than physical creatures. Others believe they're flesh and blood animals that have always shared the land with humans. The distinction between spiritual and physical isn't always clear in these traditions, and imposing Western categories might miss important nuances. One elder explained that his people had protocols for encountering such beings. You don't look directly at them. You acknowledge their presence respectfully. You don't try to follow or hunt them. You leave offerings if you must travel through their territory. These protocols suggest long experience with the creatures, accumulated knowledge passed down through generations. The protocols also imply that coexistence is possible when both parties respect certain boundaries. The modern tendency to seek definitive proof, to capture or kill specimens for scientific study, contradicts these traditional approaches. If these creatures exist and possess human-level intelligence, our attempts to prove their existence might be seen as aggressive acts that justify defensive responses. The ethics of cryptid research rarely consider the creature's perspective or autonomy. We assume the right to study and document without considering whether the creatures want to remain hidden. This ethical dimension complicates my investigation. I want evidence, but at what cost? If obtaining proof requires harassing creatures that have successfully avoided human contact, am I justified in pursuing it? The question has no easy answer. Scientific knowledge has value, but so does leaving some mysteries unsolved. The right of any intelligent being to privacy and self-determination might extend to creatures we haven't officially acknowledged. The legal status of unknown species is ambiguous. If someone killed what they claimed was a dogman, would they face charges? Current law protects specific listed species, but doesn't address creatures that science doesn't recognize. The legal void creates a dangerous situation where someone might shoot first and justify later, claiming they felt threatened by an unknown animal. Several witnesses have mentioned having firearms ready specifically in case of dogman encounters. Education about coexistence seems more productive than encouraging confrontation. If these creatures exist and avoid humans when possible, learning to recognize signs of their presence and giving them space would prevent conflicts. The traditional indigenous approach of respectful avoidance has apparently worked for generations. Modern residents might benefit from adopting similar attitudes, treating these creatures as territorial neighbors rather than targets for proof or trophies. The investigation has also revealed the psychological toll these encounters take on witnesses. Many describe lasting effects, difficulty sleeping, hypervigilance in wilderness settings, and sometimes trauma responses similar to what's seen in people who've had close calls with dangerous wildlife. The experience of encountering something that shouldn't exist but clearly does challenges fundamental assumptions about reality. Processing that cognitive dissonance takes time. Support groups have formed online where witnesses can share experiences and coping strategies. The groups provide validation and community for people whose encounters left them isolated and doubted. Members discuss everything from security measures to spiritual interpretations of what they've experienced. Some seek scientific explanations, while others embrace supernatural frameworks. The diversity of responses shows there's no single way to process these encounters. The mental health aspect deserves more attention. Dismissing witnesses as crazy or attention-seeking ignores the genuine distress many experience. Even if every sighting could be explained as misidentification, the fear and confusion witnesses feel are real. Mental health professionals in rural Alaska should be trained to work with people reporting cryptid encounters, providing support without judgment regardless of what actually occurred. Technology continues to improve, making documentation easier. Trail cameras have become more affordable and reliable. Night vision equipment is more accessible. Drones could potentially survey large areas quickly, but technology alone won't solve the mystery if these creatures actively avoid detection. They might adapt faster than our monitoring capabilities improve, staying one step ahead of our attempts to document them conclusively. The investigation has changed how I view Alaska's wilderness. I'm more cautious now when working in remote areas. I pay closer attention to signs of unusual activity. I trust my instincts when something feels wrong, and I keep my camera ready just in case. Because if these creatures are real, and if Alaska truly is a hotspot for dogman activity, then the definitive evidence is out there somewhere, waiting to be discovered. The trail camera owner has asked me to return to his property next month. He's captured something new, another image that he wants me to examine before he shares it publicly. He sounded different on the phone, more serious, almost frightened. Whatever the camera recorded has shaken him. I've agreed to make the trip. to see what new evidence has emerged from that dark Alaska forest. The investigation continues. Reports keep coming in. Witnesses keep stepping forward. And somewhere in Alaska's vast wilderness, something continues to walk upright through the trees, watching us with those reflective eyes, remaining just beyond the reach of definitive proof. Whether we'll ever have concrete answers about what these creatures are, and why Alaska seems to harbor so many of them, remains unknown, but the search goes on. For more information on cryptid encounters and ongoing investigations, consider subscribing. The mystery of Alaska's Dogman sightings is far from solved, and new evidence continues to emerge from the wilderness. Stay informed, stay safe, and if you're in Alaska, pay attention to what moves in the forest. You might be the next witness to something that science hasn't yet acknowledged, but that walks among us nonetheless.